Science Beetle.
Welcome back, students, to Science Beetle and Math 101. Today we're going to be covering common denominators. Well, remember from the previous section when we talked about fractions, we talked about fractions involving essentially a number being divided by another number. And we called the top number the numerator, and we called the bottom number the denominator. And so when we talk about common denominators, essentially what we're talking about is going to be this number at the bottom. And in particular, we're looking at the number at the bottom for two fractions. And so let's say that we have this fraction and we have another fraction here, and we want to compare and see which ones of these denominators are going to be common to both. And so this is just a general overview. Let's take a look at an actual example and see how we can come up with an actual common denominator for two fractions. So let's say that we've got, let's say 1 divided by 6, and we have another one that is 1 divided by 2. And so let's see if we can figure out the common denominator. Now remember from one of the other lessons that we did, which was the greatest common factor and the least common multiple. Well, we could do those same principles, apply those principles here, and figure out what is the greatest common, the least common multiple that each of these fractions, is particularly in the denominator, are going to have. So for example, if we take the 6, let's just do it this way. So if we take the 6, which are the multiples of 6? Well, we can have 6, and if we multiply it times 2, we'll have 12, and if we multiply it times 3, we'll have 18. Now let's try the 2, and let's multiply the 2 so we have multiples of 2. So we have a 2 times 2, 2 times 1 is 2, times 2 is 4, so times 2 is 4, times 3 is 6, times 4 is 8, times 5 is 10, and times 6 is 12. Now, when we look at this closely here, we notice that we have several numbers in common. Here we have a 6, we have a 6 here, we also have a 12, and we have a 12 here. But what we're looking for here is the least common multiple. And so the least common multiple in both of these cases, when we look at the 6 and the 2, that's going to be the 6. And so when we look for a common denominator, that's exactly what we're looking for here. Now, why do we go through this process of finding common denominators? Because sometimes we want to make sure that we eventually get to a point where we can add or subtract or multiply fractions. And this is the beginning work, or the beginning step towards that goal. So let's practice a little bit more of these common denominators, trying to locate them, and just get some more practice before we move on to the next section. So let's say we have another fraction here. Let's say that we have 1/2, and we've got 5/8. And what we're trying to do is figure out the common denominator. So we take the 2, because the 2 is a denominator, so let's identify the denominators. The denominator is the 2, and the denominator is the 8. So if we take the 2, and we try to figure out what is the multiples of 2, so we would say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And if we take the 8 and figure out multiples of it, we've got 8, 16, 24. In fact, we don't have to go any further because we just found one. So if you look at here, we notice that the 8 is a multiple of 2, but it's also a multiple of the 8. So here we have the common denominator, which is going to be 8. Now, finding the common denominator is just the first step. The next step is we want to make sure that we're able to take these fractions and then make them equivalent to one another. At least when you get the multiples up. Since we know that the 5/8 at the bottom already is at the 8, we need to make sure that we can write 1/2 as an equivalent to 1/2 using the denominator of 8. So in order to do this, what we need to do is we take the 1/2 and we need to make sure that we can equate this to an 8. And so we ask ourselves, what number times 2 will give me 8? So if I do this, I know that 4 will give me 8. So whatever number is here, I need to multiply to the top as well. So 1 times 4 will give me 4. And so 4 divided by 8 is equivalent to 1/2. And therefore, so when we do that, we can do the common denominators for the 1/2 and 5/8. We can then say that 4/8 has a common denominator with 5/8. And so if you get to this point, you can see that the next logical progression would be to want to either add or subtract these. And we can do that because we know now that the 8 is common to both of them. In other words, we're dealing with a unit that is entirely equal to one another with respect to the whole. Because remember, the top part, not only is it the numerator, but the top parts of these things are also going to be what we call the parts. And the bottom numbers here, and I'm going to put these in green, the bottom numbers here are going to be the whole. And so what we've essentially done by identifying the common denominator is identified the whole for both of these fractions when you're comparing them. In the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit more about how we go ahead and add and subtract these fractions after we've identified the common denominator. So brush up on this a little bit more, subscribe us, and see us at the next lesson.